Avi, take it away.
Ladies and gentlemen, shalom from Israel. Rebecca, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Let's go to our briefing, Israel at War. We're going to talk about this war, but it's not an update on the war. It's more about the wider perspectives of this whole thing, talking about some regional aspects of this war, talking about issues like normalization, talking about issues like the perspective in the Arab world vis-a-vis the war, and many other exciting and significant things that has to be discussed in that context. I'm very excited and very honored to know that you have been reading or you are in the midst of reading my most recent book, which is of course great. It's very atypical, sort of speaking, because most of my encounters, the people who participate did not read this book or others. And so of course it helps us to facilitate the whole briefing in much more easily, I would say, in that regard. So I'm going to start with some short introduction talking about Gaza Strip, some contemporary milestones of Gaza Strip. 1948 to 1967, Gaza Strip is ruled by Egypt. It was not annexed to Egypt, but it was ruled by an Egyptian military government. 1967 to 2005, following the 6 Days War in 1967, Israel occupied Gaza Strip, but Israel did not annex Gaza Strip. Rather, it rules Gaza Strip with a combination of a civil administration and military governance. During that period of time, Israeli governments encouraged and built Israeli communities. Some people call them settlements. Each one is very welcome to choose his own definition for it. I will use the term communities as an objective reference. Israel has built communities in Gaza Strip, 21 communities with some 10,000 Israeli citizens who lived in Gaza Strip during that period of time, secured by the Israeli Defense Forces. In 2005, Israeli parliament and the government passed a law called the Disengagement Law. And based upon that law, Israel totally evacuated Gaza Strip and handed over control to the Palestinian Authority that was established following the Israeli PLO agreement from 1993, rather known as the Oslo Accords. Israel totally evacuated all the settlements, all the communities, all the settlers, or the Israeli citizens that lived there, of course, including the Israeli Defense Forces, and handed over control to the Palestinian Authority. The rule of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza Strip didn't last longer. A year and a half later, in the summer of 2007, the Hamas, a Palestinian Islamic movement that was born in Gaza Strip in the 1980s, conducted a military coup, violently terminating the rule of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza Strip. And since 2007, Hamas has been ruling Gaza Strip. How did we get here talking about this war? Roughly speaking, it's a confluence, it's a conjunction of two major processes, developments that happened in the region for the last couple of decades. One of them has to do with the inner Palestinian power struggle over leadership, and the other one has to do with Iran's hegemonic vision. Talking about the story of the inner Palestinian power struggle over leadership, it is connected to yet another bigger power struggle in the region. This is a power struggle between different camps vis-a-vis the whole issue of what is called the national statehood. This is a power struggle that emerged following the downfall of the Turkish Ottoman Empire in the end of the First World War. And during the 20th century, that has been a major power struggle that shaped the Middle East to its core. Roughly speaking, we could identify a couple of major camps involved in this power struggle. For example, the Pan-Arab camp, the Qawm, that basically involves the establishment of one big Arab entity. Another camp is the Islamic camp, and its most well-known representative, the Muslim Brotherhood, who totally and utterly rejects the concept of national statehood, but rather alternatively vows the establishing of a caliphate, an Islamic global entity that is based upon the Islamic religious law, the Sharia Codex. Another camp is the national statehood camp that actually wants to see an independent national statehood in the region in the 20th century. And this power struggle between these three major camps, and then later on joined by the militant Islamic Salafi jihadi groups, this power struggle to a large extent shaped the story of the Middle East. Particularly when we talked about the story of the Islamic camp, the Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt in 1928. 60 years later, Hamas was established in Gaza Strip, and Hamas formally defines itself as the offspring of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. As you can understand, being an offspring of Hamas, of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas therefore totally and utterly rejects the concept of national statehood and alternatively adopts and endorses the concept of global caliphate. In that regard, it is very significant because, ironically speaking, as you probably are aware, today, following the war particularly, there are some circles in the West who echoes the slogan "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." They think that by echoing that slogan, they are actually echoing Hamas objective. That is not Hamas objective. Hamas objective, in the end of the day, is not an independent Palestinian state. A Palestinian state that will be established on the ruin of the state of Israel, as far as Hamas is concerned, is only a milestone towards the final objective, and this is the establishing of a global Islamic caliphate. The rivalry of Hamas, the Fatah organization, who is the major spine of the Palestinian Authority, comes from the hub of the national statehood. So right there, you could see there is a major conflict between these two major camps, these two major Palestinian parties, because Fatah totally rejects the concept of the caliphate. Fatah argues that it should be an independent Palestinian state, and more than that, that Palestinian state should not be based upon an Islamic religious codex, the Sharia law, but rather on a parliamentary-based legislation. Why? Because some of the Palestinians are Christians. So you cannot submerge them to the rule of the Islamic Codex. Another thing that the two camps are totally split over is the whole issue regarding the conflict with Israel. Hamas endorses the concept of the al-Muqawama al-Musallaha, the armed resistance, meaning no compromise, no concession. Israel has to be eliminated through the use of violence. Fatah, being the major spine of the Palestinian Authority, by signing the agreement, the Oslo agreement with Israel in 1993, Fatah basically de facto accepts Israel's right to exist and basically endorses the concept of the two-state solution. And so these two major Palestinian groups are fighting over influence and power within the Palestinian arena, and this is a fight for the death and life, because each and one of them basically comes from a totally different ideological and political perspective, and each one of them views itself as the one and only leader of the Palestinian people, and also the one that will dictate the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this is one major process, development that happened in the last 40 years since Hamas actually appeared in the 1980s at the stage of the Palestinian inner political system and inner public discourse. The other thing has to do with Iran's hegemonic vision. By now, I know that you have been reading the book. I guess that by now, since you, even if you reached only to the first half of the book, you already are familiar with the story of the Mullah regime in Tehran, who came to power in 1979, the Islamic Revolution, and the concept of exporting the Islamic Revolution. And that all has been done under the banner of what is called al-Muqawama, the resistance. The Mullah regime basically very sophisticatedly identified the centrality of this concept of resistance in the discussion in the Arab world. Roughly speaking, this concept of the resistance vows to eliminate the Western presence in the Middle East. It is totally rejecting Western values, consider them to be immoral, decayed, and corrupted, and also vows the elimination of the state of Israel through the use of violence. All of that is being done under the banner of liberating Palestine, a slogan that is very appealing to the Arab world culturally and politically and emotionally. And the Mullah regime identified that and actually positioned itself as the spearhead of this camp, rather known as the camp of the resistance, Mihwar al-Muqawama. Again, ironically speaking, today in some circles in the West, as you probably know, there are those who actually echoes, glorifies, praise the concept of al-Muqawama, the resistance. Those Western fans that are echoing that are basically echoing or parroting, so speaking, the concept of al-Muqawama because it was translated to them by Arab/Palestinian presence in the West. So they took the concept of al-Muqawama, the resistance, they translated it into the resistance. It is painted in a romantic colors, but the concept of the resistance for millions of people in the Middle East today, particularly the Arab world, including Palestinians, the concept of resistance brings death, destruction, and havoc. Today, this very day, Khaled Mash'al, the leader of Hamas, pushed against the war for the disaster in Gaza. Khaled Mash'al again came out and say, well, that's correct, he said. Gaza is in a total destruction because this is the price of the resistance. The counter-reaction in the Palestinian street, including, of course, as you can imagine, by the Fatah leader, is very clear. They are saying to Hamas, you brought disaster upon the people of Gaza in the name of the resistance. Your resistance, your Hamas resistance, is actually hiding in tunnels and taking shelter beyond the civilians in Gaza Strip. Your resistance caused the biggest catastrophe ever to the Palestinian people since 1948. And right now, by the way, we'll talk later on about it in the context of Lebanon, you will see the story is not much different from that. So the Mullah regime is enhancing its influence across the Middle East, building the axis of resistance, a network of armies of terror spread across the Middle East, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq, Houthis in Yemen, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza Strip. And this is part of that is the concept of what is known as the Iranians' plan to eliminate Israel through what is called the Ring of Fire, meaning all these proxies, all these armies that the Iranians arms, subsidize, finance, support, provide military know-how, and so on and so on, they all join together, and when the day comes, what is known as the unifying of the arenas, they will all attack Israel from different perspectives, from different directions. The concept of unifying of the arenas, in Arabic it's called Wahdat al-Sahat, became one of the most significant cards that the Iranian regime and the proxies use in their marketing efforts to the Arab world, let's put it that way. Basically saying to the Arab world, we are building this huge network of armies of terror in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Gaza Strip, but it's all for a noble cause. The noble cause is to liberate Palestine, and that will happen through the unifying of the arenas. The day when Wahdat al-Sahat, the day will come, and when that day will come, Israel will be eliminated. The relationship between Iran on the one hand and Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the other hand is interesting because of the fact that unlike other Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, Afghan and Pakistani and others, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. However, the relationship, the connection between the two is based upon marriage of convenience. For the Mullah regime, the continuation and escalation of the conflict is a strategic interest. Why? Because the more the conflict escalates, the more the Mullah regime can continue and market itself to the Arab world as the one that will liberate Palestine. And meanwhile, by creating these armies of terror, this axis of resistance, what happened on the ground was that the Mullah regime actually created a Trojan horse that occupied Arab states from within, like in Lebanon, like in Iraq. And for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, this is a marriage of convenience because the mullah regime provides them with the arms, finance, military know-how, intelligence. And so Hamas and Islamic Jihad can continue and pursue their radical agenda because Hamas, reminding you, is in the end of the day wants to be the one who will lead the Palestinian people along the line of the armed resistance. So here you have this unifying of arenas and the concept of the marriage of convenience between the two parts. Meanwhile, as the following October 7, of course, the war that we are all familiar with, the West Bank is also bubbling. Again, we see in the West Bank an constant Iranian effort to flare, to ignite the West Bank, taking advantage of the presence of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and local Palestinian militias in different parts of the West Bank, and trying to smuggle weapons from Jordan to the West Bank. We'll talk about it later on. It's a very significant development that we have to explore very closely. The war and the normalization. You know, one of the things that it's common to think, and I think it's to a large extent accurate, when we think about why did Hamas launch this war, one of the major issues is that clearly it was Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Iran's interest to block the process of what is known as normalization. Now, that process of normalization between Israel and Arab states, you probably are familiar with. The Abraham Accords is yet another milestone. The Israeli-UAE peace agreement, the Israeli-Bahrain peace agreement, Israel and Sudan normalization agreement, and Israel-Morocco normalization agreement, that in the background, there has been a growing reports, not baseless, that there is also a development in the trajectory of Israeli-Saudi rapprochement. For the Palestinians, for the Iranians, the Palestinians generally, and particularly Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the news about Israeli-Saudi rapprochement is a bad news because overall, the Palestinians in course of time came to the conclusion, and rightly so, that their Arab brothers are actually deserting them. Reminding you, Israel has a peace treaty with Jordan, 1994, a peace treaty with Egypt, 1979. There is an ongoing relationship between Israel and some Arab states. Then you get the story of the Abraham Accords, and then you get the story of the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement, the moving of the American embassy to Jerusalem that basically passed with not anything significant on the Arab world. All those things together basically caused an increasing panic among the Palestinians, basically saying our brothers, the Arabs, are deserting us. This is a process that as for itself is very fascinating, because this is a process that, largely speaking, reflecting two major developments, trajectories. One is the shifting prioritization of strategic interest of the Arab world, engage with an increasing both internal and external challenges, economically, socially, culturally, environmentally, facing a growing Iranian and Turkish pressure. The Arab world basically needs to prioritize its goals, its objectives, its allocation of resources. This is one major thing. And the other, not less significant, is the fatigue of the Arab world with the Palestinians, and particularly following the split between Hamas and the Fatah in 2007. All the attempts of the Arab world to reconcile the inner Palestinian rift, all those attempts failed. So there has been an accumulative process that basically results in a situation when the Arab world gradually turns to the Palestinians and said, look, we have been carrying your issue on our shoulders for decades. We are now in different times. This is a different world. This is a different region. These are different interests and different needs. You, the Palestinians, you need to make a decision. What do you want? Where do you want to go? Do you want to go Hamas way? You want to go Fatah way? Fine, bear the consequences. And so these things together resulted in this process that result more and more the tendency in part of the Arab world for rapprochement with Israel. One of the manifestations of this process, I don't know if you yet came to that in the book, you probably, maybe yes, or probably will get there, is that we saw that as an outcome of this increasing external challenging, namely particularly the Iranian hegemonic vision, and to a lesser extent, but also not insignificantly, the Turkish hegemonic vision, we saw the creation of these major arenas of tensions across the Middle East, namely the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Bab el-Mandab Strait that you see in the bottom of the map, an enormously strategic passage between Asia and Africa, connecting the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean itself, and of course the passages, the Hormuz passages between Iran and United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, this area that is actually one of the most strategic locations as well in this planet. All those arenas became an enormously significant stages for this growing power struggle between what I call the axis of stability or the alliance of stability on the one hand and axis of resistance under the leadership of Iran on the other hand. And the circles that you see in front of you reflects to you how that strategic interest bring together the different players. So you see that in each and every one of these circles, you will find Israel, you will find Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. They all share the same strategic interest in context of stability, in context of the securing of their strategic, economic, long-term strategic interest, and pushing back the Iranian aggression. That forming alliance of stability, basically when the test came, that forming alliance basically proved itself. And of course, I'm referring to the famous episode of the Iranian direct attack on Israel in April 14, April 15. A coalition led by the United States of America with the proactive, and I re-emphasize, the proactive involvement of some of these members of this alliance, Jordan, the Saudis, basically intercepted the Iranian attack on Israel. You may remember this whole episode, hundreds of missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and rockets launched from Iran, directly from Iran, targeting Israel. 99% of those incoming rockets and missiles and drones have been intercepted. Many of them basically were intercepted outside. Most of them were intercepted outside the boundaries of Israel, including, as I said before, the proactive involvement of the members of this alliance of stability under the leadership of the United States. Let us talk a little bit about the war and regional players. I deliberately chose four significant members of this in that regards, because I think it's very significant to follow that story. Let me start with the Saudis. You see that the Saudis, I wrote on defense. Since the beginning of the war, the Saudis basically clearly send a couple of messages. First, they would like to see definitely a new situation in Gaza Strip where Hamas is not any longer playing the role it played in Gaza Strip up until October 2nd. In that regard, I want to emphasize something very simple. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, they view Hamas as a major threat to their own national security. Egypt is hunting down the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the mother movement of Hamas. A couple of weeks ago, Egyptian court sentenced to death 8 leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Saudi Arabia arrested Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood people in Saudi Arabia. The same goes as for the United Arab Emirates. In a minute, I will elaborate talking about Jordan. So from their perspective, anything that in the end of the day limits to the maximum Hamas' ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda, namely Iran's radical agenda, for those states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, this is a good news. Of course, the question is, how do you do that? And that comes to the other thing when we are talking about Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are sending in parallel signal that says, we are willing to go towards normalization, but we have conditions. And the condition is settling the situation in Gaza, ending the war, again, in a way that will not enable Hamas to recontrol Gaza, and moving forward towards the issue of establishing a Palestinian independent state next to the state of Israel. In that regard, there is no change in the Saudi position. What is known as the Arab Initiative, peace initiative of the Arabs, is basically going back to 2002, when the Saudis back then came with the peace initiative, later on formally confirmed and affirmed by the Arab League that year in Beirut, in Lebanon, in 2002. And basically it says the same things. Independent Palestinian state next to Jerusalem. Is Jerusalem the capital of the Palestinians? A just and fair solution to the issues that are at hand according to the international decisions and international laws. Nothing significantly has changed in that regard on the formal level. If you listen to the subtext of the Saudis spokesperson, you could identify that, well, the Saudis are not necessarily going to lie on the fence to make sure that there is going to be a Palestinian state, mostly because, and it goes back to what I said before, they know that the inner Palestinian arena is basically totally and utterly not ready and not able to be on that phase. Next to Saudi, you see the Syrian flag. Syria is a very interesting story in that context. As you probably know, the war in Syria starting in 2011, the Iranians rushed to save Assad regime. They sent in Hezbollah, they sent the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, they sent to Syria Pakistani and Afghan and Iraqi Shiite militias to save Assad regime from falling down. At some point in 2015, where it seems like despite of their efforts, Assad regime is going down, desperately the Iranians turned to Putin. Putin jumped on the opportunity and basically went into the war in Syria and turning the table and securing Assad regime in Syria. In the last, roughly speaking, year, we noticed some interesting development in the context of the Assad regime and the Iranians. Roughly speaking, there is an accumulating information that suggests that there is a growing gap between Assad and the Iranian regime. There is a growing tension between Assad and the Iranian regime, reminding you that about a year ago, after more than a decade of a war, after Syria has lost its seat in the Arab League, Syria was welcomed back into the arms of the Arab world in 2023. The underlying guiding concept of the Arab world to take back Assad regime, despite of the fact that Assad butchered its people, despite of the fact that Assad turned Syria into an Iranian colony. The underlying logic of the Arab world was, well, if we will take Assad back and we will lure Assad with the finance that we could pour in Syria to reconstruct devastated Syria, that will basically be the price tag for Assad to detach itself from the Iranian regime. So Assad constantly is playing on all the weddings. Interesting enough, a year ago, when Assad was welcomed back in the Arab League, he gave a speech that was an enormously condescending. It was like slapping the wrist of the Arab world for the years that they gave him hell for the fact that he butchered his own people in the war. It was a very condescending speech. Assad definitely felt back then that he is on the saddle, and the speech that he made was a clear manifestation of that. A year later, a couple of months ago, there was another Arab League summit. In this summit, Assad was told to shut up. He didn't talk. He was not given the permission to talk. And basically, the Arab world sent Assad a message that says, look, we took you back. It comes with a price tag. You know what the price tag is. You don't do anything, but yet you are expecting us to bring the money, and you are thinking that you will give us some condescending speeches. It's not going to happen. And so there is an interesting development in the context that Assad apparently started to receive this signal, and the conflict now maneuvering between the Iranians on the one hand and the Arab on the other hand. And now the tension between Assad and the Iranians is further fueled due to the fact that Israel has intensified its attacks in Syria since the war, since October 7, and particularly in the last couple of months. But not only that Israel intensified the attacks, now the attacks have been mostly focusing on senior Iranian generals and commanders in Syria. And that blew the Iranians' mind. They went bananas with that story because they basically think, maybe it's not baseless, that the fact that Israel has such an accurate intelligence about the whereabouts of these people who are doing everything possible to remain in the shade, the fact that Israel has such an intelligence that basically enables Israel to pinpoint these people, to take them out, which is a major blow to the Iranian regime. These are significant leaders of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards. The Iranians heavily suspect that Assad regime is the one leaking the intelligence to Israel. And that creates a lot of tension between Assad and the Iranian regime. So it's interesting to see how Assad is continuing its dancing on both weddings. And now the tension between Assad and the Iranians further boosted, given the fact that when the Hezbollah is engaged with an exchange of punches with Israel since October 8th, and is paying a growing significant price for that, there has been an anticipation in the Iranian side that Assad regime will be more proactive in this part, basically alleviating a little bit the pressure on Hezbollah by launching some sort of like unrest in the Israeli Golan, part of the Golan, by launching attacks from Syria. It relatively almost did not happen, meaning that Assad regime basically sends a signal to the Iranians, says, I'm not going to join into this party. I want to stay out. I want to neutralize myself of that. So all these things are fueling a growing tension between Iran and Syria, which of course has a lot of ramifications. And this is definitely something to follow very closely. Moving to Lebanon, above Saudi Arabia, here is the bottom line. The Lebanese are screaming at Hezbollah's face and say, do not drag us to this war. It's not our war. With all due respect to the Palestinians and the issue of Palestine, it's not our war. Do not drag us to this war. Obviously, Hezbollah ignores the outcry of the Lebanese. The interesting thing about the outcry of the Lebanese is that it is across the board. Christians and Druze and Sunnis and Shiites who actually screams at Hezbollah's leader's face, Nasrallah, and say, you are dragging us to death and destruction in the service of Iran. You are basically kidnapped Lebanon. Lebanese people, you should know that, are addressing the Arab world and the international community. I'm talking about both Lebanese politicians, I'm talking about Lebanese activists, regular people, and they are saying to the Arab world and to the international community, help, we have been kidnapped by Hezbollah in Iran, we are powerless, help us end this grip of the Iranians. They are right. Lebanon has been kidnapped by Iran and Hezbollah with the weapons that the Hezbollah maintains under the banner of the famous resistance. Once again, here in the context of Lebanon, like in the context of the Palestinians, we see the terrible price Arab states are paying for the deception that is called the resistance. I can tell you, I'm watching, as you can understand, on a daily basis, lots of information from the Arab world. Obviously, Lebanon is a major place. It's amazing to see the amount of anger, frustration, hate that Lebanese are expressing towards what happened to their country that once used to be known as Paris of the Middle East. Lebanon has been kidnapped by Iran and Hezbollah in the name of the resistance. Jordan. Iran and Hamas are now setting their eyes on Jordan. Iran now controls Lebanon. Iran has a significant influence in Syria. It has significant influence in Iraq. Jordan is the last piece in the puzzle of the Iranian dream to take over this whole region between Iran and the Mediterranean Sea. The Mullah regime and its militias are constantly smuggling drugs and weapons to Jordan from South Syria. The drugs are heading both to Jordan and down towards the Gulf states. Some of it makes its way to the West Bank. The weapon aims to basically either smuggle to the West Bank and or to create terror infrastructure in Jordan. Jordan is now became a target of Hamas and the Iranians. The Iranians want to turn Jordan to yet another style of Gaza, meaning to turn Jordan into a launching pad of attacks against Israel, and again, under the banner of the resistance. For the Iranians, that will be the last piece in the puzzle, and they will conclude their control over this area. Hamas views Jordan as its next target. Reminding you, Hamas is coming from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic Caliphate. Hamas multi-stage plan says, we took Gaza Strip, we create an Islamic Emirate in Gaza Strip. The next thing is to topple down Israel and to extend this Islamic Emirate to Israel, what was Israel, and the West Bank. The next stage will be Jordan. Hamas and Iran know that there is a potential in Jordan that could play to their hands. That potential is mostly because of two major issues. One, majority of the Jordanians are Palestinians. Jordan has a peace treaty with Israel. Unfortunately, however, there is a widespread animosity towards Israel in Jordan, across the board. Obviously, that animosity has been further fueled following the war between Israel and Hamas. At some point, Hamas turned and continued to turn to the Palestinians, to the Jordanians, and say, you have to protest by all means to basically put pressure on the Jordanian government to abolish the peace treaty. That Hamas pressure resulted in demonstrations in Jordan, some of them violent, that the Jordanian Authority had to crush strongly. The Jordanian Authority are aware of Hamas game. So when it was reported that Hamas leaders may be deported from Qatar, Hamas leaders says, well, we will move to Jordan because we have Jordanian citizenship. And the Jordanians said, forget about it. Jordan is not a hotel. The reason for that is because the Jordanians know exactly that Hamas means troubles. The other thing that could play to the hands of the Iranians and Hamas is the fact that there is a strong Islamist camp in Jordan, including the Muslim Brotherhood, though they are under the close monitoring and control of the authorities. They are strong, they are there. Recently, there has been a Jordanian politician who is affiliated with Hamas, was elected to be the next General Secretary of the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. One of the first things that this person did was to give an interview to Al Jazeera, basically urging the Jordanian authorities to open a new chapter, a new page in the relationship with Hamas. In other words, actually to open the borders and enable Hamas to increase its influence in Jordan with all the ramifications that comes along with it. In addition to that, the Iranians and Hamas can take an advantage of the fact that there is a lot of dire hardships in Jordan economically, socially, and so on. They could easily incentivize people to be engaged in terror and criminal activities for few dollars, sort of speaking. And indeed, the Jordanian Authority in the last couple of months revealed a couple of terror cells in Jordan affiliated with both Hamas and the Iranian regime. The development in Jordan are very significant. We have to watch it very closely. Jordan has the ability for the time being and in the future to push back the attempt of the Iranians to destabilize the situation in the kingdom. The Jordanians knows exactly what's the story of the resistance, though most of them are Palestinians and they identify with the Palestinians and so on. They do know that the concept of this resistance brought death and destruction upon their brothers across the Arab world. The Jordanians are Sunnis. There are really no Shiites in Jordan. So that also makes it more difficult for the Iranians to go in. The Jordanians are proactively acting militarily in South Syria to push back the smuggling of weapons and drugs by the Iranians. Right now in South Syria, there are two major local allies that could be very useful to that end for the Jordanians. One are the Druze and the other one are the Arab tribes of South Syria that could be a very significant allies of the Jordanian regime trying to stabilize its northern border. Follow the situation in Jordan very, very closely. A few words about the war and global players. The United States, in the whole scenario right now, what's going on in the region, yet again, it's a kind of like a mixed picture. On the one hand, following the war immediately, President Biden's firm position, basically saying Hamas rule in Gaza Strip must end, and his very clear message to the Hezbollah and the Iran in one word, don't. That was a very strong, decisive statement by the United States after a long period of time of a very vague, non-clear position, which, by the way, degraded United States' image as the leading superpower. Players in the region looked at the US administration's policies in the last couple of decades, and the bottom line is that the US policies vis-a-vis the Middle East are characterized by a vagueness, non-decisive, jumping from one place to another policies, to the point regional players in the Middle East questions to what extent they can rely on the United States of America. Following October 7th, the very decisive position of Biden administration and Biden himself, to be more accurate, basically to a large extent restore the declining image rehabilitates the declining image of the United States. But yet again, since there has been again this push and shove within the US policy vis-a-vis the region that once again raised to the surface the question of regional players. What exactly is the US policy? Do they want to see Hamas rule in Gaza Strip comes to an end? So why do they do that? And if they do that, what does it mean? So there is a constant yet questioning among regional players vis-a-vis the US policy in the region, which is again something that is not new, but in such dynamic environment with lots of challenges, it has to be closely followed. The position of the United States in two arenas, meaning assembling the coalition that is fighting against the Houthis attacks in the Red Sea, and the proactive role of the United States leading the coalition that intercepted the Iranian attack, those two things help to rehabilitate once again the United States image as the leading superpower. But it's constantly being viewed, questioned by regional players. What is going to be the next trend? Are we going to see yet again another shift in the US policy? Or is it going to be a constant, clear line, decisive line? This is an open question. This is the way the United States, to a large extent, is viewed in the region. Which brings us to China. Since the beginning of the war, the Chinese, roughly speaking, as always, try to play all sides, but were clearly closer to the Palestinian/Hamas position, which caused a lot of anger in Israel and frustration, given the fact that the Chinese has been flirting Israel for years. The Chinese clearly are very interested in Israel. They made lots of investments in Israel. The Chinese position, which, by the way, at some point, the Chinese kind of like tried to do some damage control. They understood at some point that they may have been a little bit too non-balanced, sort of speaking, to put it this way. And yet again, it's interesting to see that in Israel, I would say, there is the position of the Chinese following October 7, their policy, further boosted an already existing suspicious and questions marks within Israel regarding this whole partnership with this enormous giant. Those questions were there before because we know that the Chinese hug is also a very suffocating hug. Yes, on the one hand, China is an enormously significant player, obviously. Yes, Israel, to a large extent, benefits the relationship with China, but on the other hand, the issue of the price tag is becoming more and more significant in that regard. And by the way, couple of days ago, the Israeli foreign minister basically kind of like sent a balloon test to the Chinese, where he made a statement and said to the Hezbollah, he said, you may want Hezbollah, you may want to consider the fact that if you're going to attack Haifa, the port in Haifa, the new port in Haifa is operated by Chinese company. That was kind of like a hint to China to basically say, we expect you, China, to be a little bit more proactive in restraining the Iranians and their proxies, and particularly Hezbollah. Same, by the way, same approach conducted by the Saudis, who turn to the Chinese and say, well, we expect you guys to be a little bit more proactively sending message to Iran, which is a very significant partner of China, and China is an enormously significant client of Iran. We expect you to restrain the Iranians in what's going on in the Red Sea. Putin, Russia, engage mostly in the war in Ukraine, yet again, also all the time expanding and looking for ways to expand its presence and influence in the region. In that regard, other than the story of the Russian presence in Syria, the Russian presence in Libya, interesting stage that the Russians recently are more and more proactively trying to get in, Sudan, because of the war that is going on in Sudan for more than a year. The Russians are trying clearly to set a foot as well there, as they are trying to extend any way possible their presence and influence across the region. In that regard, it's interesting to see that in the context of Israel-Russia relationship, we didn't really notice the significant changes in the last following October 7, though, by the way, I should emphasize, Russia has good relationship with Hamas and the Fatah. There is a Hamas delegation in Russia. In fact, both Russia and China hosted dialogue between the rivals, the Palestinians' rivals, Hamas and Fatah. Both dialogues resulted with nothing, of course, but it's interesting to see that they are trying to, of course, monetize the opportunity, sort of speaking, to further extend their presence and influence. The United Nations, as you probably are aware, its role in the whole story, it's very controversial, to put it this way. We are all familiar with the reports about the role of the United Nations Relief and Welfare Agency, UNRWA, in Gaza Strip, reminding you yet again, the people of UNRWA in Gaza Strip many of them are Hamas people. So here, this is something that needs to be re-emphasized and remembered. On the other hand, UNRWA is operating based upon a mandate that it was given to by the United Nations. So as far as UNRWA is concerned, they are doing their job. Unless their mandate is going to be abolished, this is their job. The people on the ground, in the end of the day, obviously are in Gaza are Hamas people, most of them, not all of them, of course, but most of them. The other thing in the context of the international community, there has been a lot of criticism on the position of the General Secretary of the United Nations vis-a-vis the whole situation. I wouldn't go into that. Each one brings, of course, its own perspective. We all remember, of course, the whole issue of the International Court of Justice, as well as the International Criminal Court. Yet again, there is, it's important, and this goes to a legal aspect that should be discussed maybe by more legal experts who deals with that, about the differences between the International Court of Justice and the International Court of the Criminal Court. Roughly speaking, the Criminal Court does not deal with states. It deals with individuals that are suspected to be engaged in war crimes. And under its authority, the 134 countries that are signed on the treaty, by the way, Israel and the United States are not part of the treaty, basically supposed to obey the orders of the court. If the court issues an arrest warranty against individuals, and those individuals are landing in one of those states that signed on the treaty, they have to turn this person to the court. It's interesting, I think, also to emphasize that in the context of the International Court of the Criminal Court, it does not a priori dislegitimize the issue of siege. It says, as for itself, is not illegitimate, it's not illegal, but it has to be done in a way that does not jeopardize the basic minimal humanitarian needs. This is one thing. And the other thing, which I think is significant to notice, the statement of the prosecutor of the International Crime Court was basically distinguishing between Israel and Hamas in the sense that the Israeli individuals named by the court are charged with felonies that or acts that are basically has to do with violating human rights, not war crime. Hamas leaders are affiliated, according to the statement of the prosecutor, with war crimes. As for the International Court of Justice, I'm sure that you have been following the discussions there, the Israeli positions, the decision of the International Court that in the bottom line basically did not actually order Israel to stop the war. It basically ordered Israel to stop specific actions if those actions may result in or might result in a violation of human rights and could lead to a disastrous humanitarian crisis. So these are all nuances that we have to keep in mind when we are talking about it. Towards the end, some Arab perspectives on the war. Look, on one level, in the Arab world, the very common narrative is saying Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza. It is a barbaric attack of Israel. There is a lot of anger and hatred expressed to Israel, and obviously identification and solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. This is one level, both on a popular discussion, on a public realm, political levels, and so on, not surprising. However, it's not less significant to emphasize there is an enormous criticism in the Arab world on Hamas. That criticism did not start on October 7. It was there way before October 7. It's boosted following of October 7. The essence of the Arab criticism on Hamas before October 7 and mostly following October 7, three focal points. First, you, Hamas, you, by taking over Gaza Strip violently in 2007, you fractured, you damaged the Palestinian unity, and therefore you damaged the Palestinian cause. Second, your radical agenda, al-kifah, al-muqawama al-sallaha, the armed resistance, basically led Gaza Strip to havoc, death, and destruction. You didn't really result in any constructive outcome for the Palestinian people. And the third, which I think is the most powerful, at least emotionally, focal point of criticism is that Arab world says to Hamas, you are willingly, knowingly, intentionally sacrificing your own brothers and sisters, literally, at the altar of the Iranian regime's vision. It's the same Iranian regime that butchers your brothers, the Sunnis, across the Arab world. It's the same Iranian regime that butchered your brothers, the Palestinians, in the war in Syria. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in the war in Syria by Iran and its militias, including, by the way, Palestinian militias. And those points of criticism, as you could understand, were boosted following October 7. So the common narrative that you will find in the Arab world will say, Israel destroys Gaza Strip, but the reason for that is Hamas' decision to launch this war in October 7. One of the powerful things that I'm using many times in my presentation, and I find it to be very impactful, is to share some cartoons from the Arab world. And those cartoons shows you, illustrates what I just said. Like, for example, if you look to the right-hand side in the top, you could see a cartoon showing the Iranian regime as the puppeteer. He's holding two puppets. One is Hamas, the other one is Islamic Jihad, and the Arabic script beneath says Qita' Gaza, which means Gaza Strip. The message here is clear. The Iranian regime is using you, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad as puppets to sacrifice Gaza Strip at the altar of the Iranian regime. The same narrative is expressed below when you see once again the Iranian regime. Now he's holding two other puppets. One is the Houthis in Yemen, and the other one is Hezbollah in Lebanon. Look to the left-hand side in the bottom, you see an interesting cartoon. You see it has two parts. In the left side, you see this figure standing and it's shooting with its pistol. This is the Iranian regime. You see there are two figures beneath, they are bending. One is white, the other one is black. You see an arrow that pointing to Israel. You see the Star of David. So the signal has been given. This is the second picture. The white figure is rushing to fight Israel. The white figure represents Hamas and Islamic Jihad. But the black figure remains in its place. It's not joining Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And if you look closely, you could see that it's attached. It's chained to the Mullah regime. The message here is to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, particularly Hamas, is you thought that the day of unifying of the arenas that I mentioned before, you thought that day is coming. You have been deceived by your bodies, the axis of resistance, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and others. And basically, they let you to believe that when you will launch October 7 war, they will join you. But they did not. They remain where they are, and you, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, you run to the war. Now you are facing Israel's rage. Now Gaza Strip is destroyed, and this is your responsibility. The day after, look, Hamas is not going to disappear. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. But I want to emphasize something when we are talking about the challenge of Iran and the axis of resistance. This is an enormous challenge. This is nothing less than an existential threat to the state of Israel. Nothing less. And I'm not talking about the nuclear issue. And when we talk about understanding the nature of this challenge, there are two significant components that I think very significant to convey to Western audience. Why? Because they are totally alien to the Western mindset. We are dealing here with enemies that vow to eliminate Israel. This is a full commitment. It's commitment, which is of course totally alien to the mindset of people in the West, or at least most of the people in the West. And the other thing which is enormously significant, as we saw it in Gaza Strip, as we see it in Lebanon, those enemies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, they have no problem to sacrifice their brothers and sisters. Again, this is something that is totally alien to Western mindset, but it has to be emphasized. And one more thing that needs to be emphasized. As far as Iran and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah are concerned, they view the situation as if they are in a momentum. They, in their perspective, are in the right way. It's important to emphasize that because they view it that way, and that's going to shape their upcoming behavior and upcoming decisions. And the other aspect of that has to do with the story of the Alliance of Stability. Hamas is not going to disappear. It's part and parcel of the Palestinian people. It's part and parcel of the region, rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood. The issue here is not to eliminate Hamas. The issue here, in the end of the day, is to create a situation where Hamas is no longer able to continue and to dictate its radical agenda and the Iranian radical agenda, as it has been unfortunately very successfully doing for the last 40 years. 40. The meaning of that, if you want to achieve that, there are two major trajectories that you have to take. One is to crush Hamas military spine. It's not to say that you eliminate every single Hamas person and you eliminate the last rockets. That's not the point. It's to eliminate its ability to continue and operate as a very structured military power and a growing military power that has the ability to dictate its agenda on the region. Without this military power, you cannot dictate your agenda. And the other trajectory is to bring the regional factors that I mentioned before, who view Hamas as a threat and understand that it is their interest, not less of Israel and the Palestinians, to limit Hamas' ability to influence and dictate its agenda. And those players need to be, in the end of the day, part of what I call the regional envelope that create a scaffoldings to start building a new reality in Gaza Strip, where Hamas is not any longer playing the same role he played in Gaza Strip until October 7. So these are the two trajectories that has to be taken. Obviously, it takes a lot of ins and outs. There are many layers to that, but roughly speaking, these are the two major trajectories to take. And one last thing, again, the Iranian threat manifested every day around us. I kind of like illustrated and I say, look, one Iranian proxy, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, holds Israelis hostages, but also holds Palestinians hostages. Because they don't care about their brothers and sisters. Another proxy of Iran, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, holds Lebanon hostage because they don't care about the screaming of the Lebanese who say, we don't want to be dragged into this war. It's not our war. We want to live. Another Iranian proxy, the Houthis in Yemen, are holding the world hostage, attacking world traffic, maritime traffic in the Bab el-Mandab Strait and the Red Sea. These are all things that in the end of the day goes back to the Iranian regime. It goes back to the significant threat it presents to Israel, to the region, to the world. Definitely a major challenge that has to be seriously addressed proactively. And one last thing, I'm concluding my presentation at this point, is just as an update. We will be in the United States from September 24 until July 25, as we have learned that our educational content is enormously required and needed, particularly in this time where people are craving for education, factual-based, contextualized-based, and nuance-based education. So we have made a decision to move to the States for a year, from September 24 to July 25. And we will be very happy and honored to explore possibilities to work together with you according to your needs. Obviously, this is something that we'll be happy to follow and to develop. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation and opening this session to the questions.
Thank you so much, Avi. Wow, my head is reeling. I have so many questions, but I'm going to open it up to our staff first. So Dimas, go for it.
Hey, Avi. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. First of all, huge fan of your book. I've already read it a couple of times. And also Streamline helped a lot to kind of frame a lot of the conversations I was having with students that I directly work with. My question for you is, as we look to the north in Lebanon, I've heard of some factions in Iraq as well as Afghanistan, specifically the Taliban, saying that they're going to lend their support if there is an attack happening. What have you heard about any other allies to Hezbollah specifically that are willing to jump into the fight if there is a fight between the IDF and Hezbollah forces?
Yes, thank you. I mentioned before the network of the Iranian proxies. I mentioned also the Iraqi Shiite militias. The leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, basically in one of his speeches basically said, we have 100,000 militants that are ready to come together. The number is not exaggerated necessarily when you take into consideration the different militias. However, talking specifically about the Iraqi Shiite militias, they are already engaged in this war through here and there attacks, sporadic attacks on Israel, as you probably know. A couple of days ago, the leader of one of the major Iraqi Shiite, Iranian-backed Iraqi Shiite, Akram al-Ka'bi, the leader of al-Nujaba, was in Beirut, and he made a statement that basically they will stand by the Hezbollah if the war is going to extend. The Iraqi Shiite militias are involved on the one hand. I don't know to say exactly whether this involvement is going to significantly evolve if there is going to be a whole-out war. Reminding you what I told you about Assad in Syria, which is a very significant location, because in the end of the day, if the Iraqi Shiite militias wants to be on the ground involved, it means that they have to be physically. In order to be there, they have to be either in Syria, which they basically present partly in Syria, particularly in the eastern part, or in Jordan. Jordan basically, of course, are not going to allow them to go in to Jordan, even though, by the way, they asked for that, and the Jordanians basically declined it, of course, because they know what does it mean. And so I don't know to say necessarily if we are going to see thousands of Iraqi Shiite militias storming the Israeli border, but we should expect, I would say, some sort of involvement of the Iraqi Shiite militias, which already, as I said before, are involved in that. There are other militias, the Pakistani and Afghan militias that are based in Syria. I don't think that they have significantly something to add into this already big complex. By the way, recently, Pakistan, which is very interesting, defined the Fatimiyun Pakistani Shiite militias. They defined them as a terror organization. Interesting to notice that, but that's my take on that issue.
Jess, go for it.
Hi, Avi. Thank you so much for joining us. My question is, can you explain a little bit about Turkey's role in the current conflict?
Yes, Turkey is under the leadership of Erdogan has been also very much proactively involved in some kind of like imperialistic vision. Erdogan comes from the Islamic Sunni hub, is affiliated or close to the Muslim Brotherhood. Erdogan is a very shrewd politician. He changed Turkey dramatically from a state that was by constitution a secular. He basically turns Turkey to an Islamic or affiliated Islamic state. Against lots of predictions, he survived the recent elections and stayed in power. And he has been kind of like guided by this vision of him and Turkey as the new Ottoman leaders of the Middle East, re-establishing the glorious day of Ottoman Empire days. One of the things in the context of Turkey and the whole story of the region is Turkey constantly, Erdogan is playing the Palestinian card, of course, as its will, as well as the Islamic card. For a period of time, Erdogan was going all the way to basically confront major Arab players, Egypt and the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, when he was kind of like thinking that that will be the card that will help him to position itself as the leader of the region. Obviously, the Arab states, to say the least, are not excited about it. But then when Turkey's economic challenges grew significantly, and they are very significant, Erdogan had no choice but to turn to the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and the Saudis to ask them to basically save the crumbling Turkish economy. And accordingly, his melody was totally changed. Now it's become hugging and kissing, by the way, including with the Egyptians as well. And when that happened, one of the price that Erdogan easily paid was basically to kick out Hamas people out of Turkey and to basically calm its rhetoric about Palestinians and Palestine. It's always been the case in the context of the region, and particularly in the context of such a shrewd, cynical leader like Erdogan. And by the way, Erdogan is engaged in a lot of challenges in Syria, in the northern part of Iraq. There is a growing tension between Turkey and Iraq. One of the major sources of this tension is the fact that Turkey is drying Iraq to death. Turkey built huge dams on the Euphrates and the Tigris sources in Turkey, resulting in an enormous catastrophe in Iraq, an environmental catastrophe in Iraq. It's fueling an enormous tension between the two states. Turkey is also militarily operating in North Iraq against the Kurds. Turkey has a military presence in North Iraq. And by the way, today I saw reports there has been a reigniting of massive exchange of fire between the Kurdish powers and the Turks. So Turkey is looking always for ways to increase its influence, its presence. Again, Erdogan, very sophisticated, shrewd politician, always playing with the wind, looking for the advantages, looking for the opportunities. Right now, as you know, once again, we are back into the Turkish-Israeli skirmish, which we used to know in the past. It could change the next day or the next week, yet again, according to Erdogan's needs and interest at a given time.
Thank you. Josh.
Hi, Avi. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to learn from you yourself. My question was sort of about with everything going on currently in the Middle East, as well as with that context that you provided for everything going on in the region. Looking at the future, do you find yourself, and this is a feel free to answer in any way that this resonates for you, is do you find yourself more concerned about the future of the Middle East or the future of the West based on how the West has responded to this conflict? Because I find myself looking at them in different ways, and yeah, just would love to hear what maybe your concern is on that, or where that primarily lies.
Well, look, I don't know to say necessarily concern. I would say that my evaluation and prediction is that the Middle East will continue to experience lots of turbulences that are fueled by many different factors. The inner power struggle over identity and path and direction, the challenges, the reprioritization of strategic interest also results in a lot of changes, a lot of inner pressures, a lot of fractions within societies in the Middle East. Obviously, the story of Iran and Turkey. So there are many factors that in the end of the day clearly fuel a lot of reasons to expect continuing turbulences of this region. Turbulence brings a lot of things. It brings instability, it brings havoc, it brings destruction. It can also bring some positive things. I'm always saying, I'm going back to the first decade of the 21st century when I was doing some lecture tours in the West. And I was talking about what's going on in the Middle East. Around 2008, 2009, my lecture tours in the States were titled Smoking Volcano and Fertile Ground. And people were kind of intrigued, well, what does it mean, smoking volcano, fertile ground? And I said, look, the Middle East is boiling. Things are going to erupt. But when volcano erupts, the soil is rich. It could be also fertile. And indeed, what happened shortly after that was the whole story in 2010 of what is known as the Arab Spring and so on and so on. So that's the same way I look at the story of the Middle East. As for the West, significant turbulences, again centering around issues of, among other things, identities. Right now, we have a very clear example. The recent elections to the EU clearly indicate it's about identity. First and foremost, it's about identity of people. And clearly there is today, the pendulum is now swifting to the other side in the context of identity. The message that is coming, I think, quite clearly from different parts of the West. And I would also add to that the United States. People are in a deep need for clear identity that distinct them as individuals, as a society, as a cultural, ethnic, religious community. I think that's the right way to look at what we see right now. To that, there are many components that has to be added. Of course, we don't have the frame now to elaborate on that. It's a fascinating discussion for itself. But I would say that the bottom line, it's not surprising it's in a way, it's a kind of like a counter reaction to the story that has been ruling the Western sphere in the last generation, titled globalization. I think that what we see today is that the pendulum is now swifting to the other side. And people say, with all due respect to globalization, where are we in this globalization? Where are we in terms of identity? It goes, in the end of the day, to issues of identity.
Thank you, Avi. Mary, go for it.
Thank you. And thank you, Avi. That was a really phenomenal presentation. And I'm really excited to hear from you because we really enjoyed your book and Seamline and all of that. So my question is, when we were watching you last year in Seamline, we saw you trying to help rebuild relationships between the Arab and Jewish communities. How do you see that being different now post October 7th? And do you think that you'll have those same opportunities, or how has the war impacted that?
That's an amazing question. It's a great question. It's fascinating because I didn't touch on that in my briefing. But here is something very significant to notice. Israeli Arabs and Jerusalemite Palestinians almost totally are left outside of the whole story of the war. This is very, very, very significant because it indicates many things. One of the things that it indicates, and I know that, is that for many people among those groups, Israeli Arabs and Jerusalemite Palestinians, most of whom are Muslims in their religion, I can definitely say that for them, October 7 is a very challenging point. As Muslims, as Arabs, I came across more than once Muslims and Arabs across the region, including Israeli Arabs, including Jerusalemite Palestinians, who said, we don't stand for what happened on October 7. This is not us. This is not my identity as a Muslim. This is not my moral code. This is not what I stand for. So this is one interesting element, which is definitely very interesting. And by the way, it caused Hamas a lot of frustration and disappointment. Hamas was building on the joining of those groups into the havoc. It didn't happen. But in the context of both, again, Israeli Arabs and Jerusalemite Palestinians, I may say that it also indicates some changes of priorities, where actually they're saying, yes, we have different components of identities, but we now see our most upscale priority not necessarily as being proactively involved in the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but being mostly active in issues that are important for us as an individual, as a community, not necessarily in the context of the political aspect. Which is also something very interesting to follow. Look, I mean, we are looking at the most brutal Israeli-Palestinian collision ever. And you would expect that those communities will be totally in that whole story. They are not. Obviously, it calls for deep thinking, why is that? And I'm giving some examples or some thoughts why I think is that. And so I think it's definitely something interesting, very interesting to follow. And particularly, for example, when you talk about the story of the very complex fabric of the Israeli society, because 20% of the Israeli societies are Israeli Arabs, which, by the way, I think this is one of the, I would say, more of the light points in this whole very dark tunnel that we are all going through. In the last almost year, saying all, I'm also, of course, referring to Palestinians, not only Israelis.
Thank you so much, Avi. Avi's incredible wife, Maya, has graciously offered a few extra minutes of Avi's time if anyone has any final questions. Otherwise, I will finally get to ask mine. Okay, for anyone who has to hop off, feel free to hop off. I think this question is definitely one that our campus team not only has discussed a lot, but also I'm sure we still think about as we're reading your book. You know, Seamline and Inside the Middle East were both written and produced long before October 7th. Now, looking back at the work that you put together, you know, post October 7th, would you go about this differently? How does it feel looking back on your work? I know when we were watching Seamline, we had questions about the relationships that you had with the different people you interviewed and how those relationships may or may not have changed post October 7th. So just really more touching, if you don't mind, a little bit on how your work has or hasn't changed post October 7th.
Well, in the context of the Seamline, it's relatively less relevant because my work, I'm no longer in my position in Jerusalem, as you saw in the Seamline, that was in the 90s. Obviously, I keep here and there touch with the people. You saw the people in the Seamline, both the Arabs and the Jews. And obviously, it will always be part of my my life, my professional and personal background. I definitely, as I said before, noticed the fact that, roughly speaking, Jerusalem Palestinians stayed on the side, did not join this whole story of the war, and I'm very glad for that, of course, obviously for everyone. I hope that it will remain that way. I think it will remain that way. I hope, maybe I want to believe it will remain, roughly speaking, that way. Again, it's like, you know, in the many delicate positions I had, and particularly in Jerusalem, it calls for the ability to have constant finger on the pulse, and it's not something that necessarily can be achieved through an academic work. It can be done through the jobs that I was doing on the ground. And that's an advantage because it enabled me to sense. Sometimes there are very delicate currents that you have to be very sensitive to feel them or to sense them, even if you don't understand exactly what you're looking at or what you're feeling. But I think that many times in my career, and particularly in Jerusalem, I think that I can say as a fact that I was able to do that. So it helped me in that regard. And that kind of like segues to talk about my work generally as a Middle East expert. Look, again, I'm very honored and flattered by the fact that you read this 700-page book. Our wonderful donors and board basically said to me, look, next time you should write 7 books of 100 pages, not one book of 700 pages. But it reiterates, and I'm very happy to say that. It reiterates one of my major guiding lines. I always say that. I said, look, I must put my knowledge to the test of reality. I cannot find shelter beyond vague statements because this is the only way that I can evaluate whether my prediction or reading of reality is accurate or not. I don't have any other mechanism. And why do I say it to you? Because you read or read the recent book, Inside the Middle East. And when you read the book, I'm sure that you notice that many predictions in this book, many scenarios that have been portrayed in this book are validated in front of our eyes. They are basically materialized. It means that my reading of the reality was accurate. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that to send a message, which is enormously significant and particularly has to do with the challenge that we are experiencing today in the West. One of the flaws of educational system that results in what we see today in campuses is the fact that in the end of the day, the people who have been given the mandate to educate are not meeting 100% their professional and moral commitment to their position. If I was teaching in a Columbia or Brown or any university in the United States, as I was teaching in Gettysburg College, I would always ask my students to pursue information, to apply critical thinking, to put their knowledge to the test of reality as I'm doing. And those are things that unfortunately has been to a large extent pushed aside. And this is one of the major reasons for what we see in some of the campuses today. And that has to be changed. It has to be changed not only because of the story of Israel, because the damage it has inflicted on the fabric and the moral structure is severe. Severe. And therefore it has to be addressed. And the core of the address is very simple. You cannot look at a complex world through a lenses of very digestible and wonderfully sound concepts and theories. You can do that, but you have to put them to the test of the reality. And if it does not stand the test of the reality, you have to abandon them because they are not right. They are not offering you a better way to accurately understand reality. I don't know if you have reached to this point in the book, and that will be my concluding statement at this point. But of the many predictions in this book, I talked about Iranian-Israel collision. I talked about the story of Hezbollah, many, many things that I talked about, and the Houthis. There is one specific prediction that I wish that I was wrong about it. I wish I was wrong about it, but I was not. And this is the prediction. It's a very small phrase. It basically says, if Hamas will be continued to be exempted from responsibility, it's going to result in catastrophe for Israelis and Palestinians. I wish I was wrong because unfortunately I'm not. We got October 7 and everything following that. And why do I emphasize that? Because Hamas would have been and should have been held responsible and accountable had there been a real educational process in the educational centers. Because had there been such a process that basically demand context and nuance and facts and understanding the players, we may have not been in this place. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And unfortunately, Hamas is still exempted from responsibility. And I want to be very clear. It's not that Israel has no responsibility. Obviously, Israel has responsibility, of course. But in the end of the day, had there been a much more professional, thorough, serious educational process, we may have been in a different place. We cannot change it any longer. What's done is done, but we have to take it when we are looking ahead.
Wow, thank you so much, Avi. For this session, I learned so much nuance and facts that we can bring into our work. But I also want to take a minute to thank you for all the other work that you've done that we get to benefit from, and will continue to benefit from. You are such an incredible resource for myself and our team, and hope to continue learning from you, and just very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I will add one more thing that I believe and hope it will be also a useful tool for you in your work. Right now, these very days, we are working on a new film. It's a 60 minutes film educational program that is introducing the Middle East to Western audience. It's actually the main theme of this whole thing is to bring to the Western discussion aspects about the Middle East that are not existing in the Western discussion, but they are very significant if you want to understand the Middle East. And so there are 4, 5, or something like that, 5, 6 different angles. We are trying to do it as much as possible, audience friendly. We understand, of course, the whole challenge in the era of social media and attention span and so all those things. So we build it in a way that will be hopefully audience friendly for young generation, obviously, of course, for older generation, but particularly young generation. And one of the strongest point of this program is that we bring a lot of voices of Arabs from the Arab world that are appearing and they are talking about different aspects. So we believe that this would be a great tool to enrich the discussion about the Middle East, and through that also understand the challenges of Israel and many other things. And we hope that it will be ready and done around the fall of 24. So once it will be there, we'll be happy to share it with you and offer you as a tool that we believe could be very significant and productive in your work. It's not about trying to convince someone with a political perspective. It's not. It's about enriching discussion about the Middle East through touching aspects that are crucial, that are not existing in a discussion in the West.
Thank you, Avi. I'm actually gonna, after this call, connect you with the person who's in charge of all of our like film documentary relationships, and would love to offer that as a resource to our students. I think it would be a really helpful thing. So thank you all for being here, and hopefully, Avi, we'll see you soon.
Thank you guys. Take care, be well. Bye-bye. Shalom.
Oh my